This is an AQA Psychology GCSE revision video for the paper 2 topic of social influence with a specific focus on obedience. What is obedience? What are the explanations or theories for obedience? And what are the factors that affect obedience? So obedience is when people follow the orders of an authority figure. An authority figure is someone that has power or status over an individual. The orders authority figures give can sometimes be very harmful and make a person do something that they wouldn't usually. So Milgram conducted a really famous experiment, which is covered at A-level AQA psychology in a lot of detail. But in short, Milgram got people to electrocute another person. This wasn't a real electric shock, but they did believe it was. And they did this just because they were following orders from an experimenter. So Milgram wanted to consider, and what we have to consider is, why is it that people blindly obey such harmful orders? Now, Milgram was the son of Holocaust survivors, which is particularly why he was so interested in obedience, or destructive obedience, as you might call it. So people obeying orders that are harmful or can kill a person. So Milgram thought, is it the person? Is that why they follow orders? Is it because of who they are? Or is it because of the situation that they might find themselves in? So if it's because it's within the person, then that would be a dispositional factor. And if it's the situation, that would be a social factor. So Milgram aired more towards the social factors. He produced the agency theory, which is a social explanation of obedience. And there are 4 main points to this theory. All of them are about the environment, the social aspect the person is in. So the first thing he talks about is agency, because there are 2 ways of acting. Day to day, we are in an autonomous state. When we're not at school or work, we direct our own behaviour and we'll take responsibility for those consequences. However, sometimes we enter what's known as an agentic state. So when you do as a teacher tells you to in lesson, you are allowing someone to direct your own behaviour, but you give the responsibility to them. So if the teacher tells you to go and take some papers down a corridor to a different classroom, you're in the agentic state because you're doing as you're told by an authority figure, which is the teacher. If someone stops you and asks you why you're out of lesson, you possibly would immediately say, the teacher told me to do this. And that is because we go through this process of an agentic shift. We shift from the autonomous state into the agentic state. And this shift happens when we see someone as a figure of authority, because someone has greater power over us in a position, in their position of the social hierarchy. And it's because of our culture that we have this hierarchy. So some people have more authority than others, and the hierarchy is agreed by everyone. We've become socialised and accustomed and used to it, and we respect the social hierarchy, most people. So, for example, in schools, students are typically at the bottom of the hierarchy. They have little power and they do as they are told by their teachers. The teachers equally lose some power to the deputy teacher, the deputy head. And the deputy head is below the head teacher, who ultimately has the power, the most power within the school. In society, we see that as sort of children, then parents or adults have more power, then the court and the police have more power over your general adult, but the government has overall power. And it's because of our culture. We have been socialised to respect that hierarchy. Finally, proximity, the closeness to the authority figure or to the victim in which your order is going to affect. Typically, as proximity increases to a victim, a person starts to feel more responsible for their behaviour and they become less willing to obey. And then in contrast, the closer you are to an authority figure, the more likely you are to obey as they say. So if you're in the head teacher's office and they are telling you to remove a coat or to tuck your shirt in. Because you are close to that head teacher and you are in their office, you're more likely to follow the order rather than if they were shouting at you from across the field. So we have to evaluate this theory of Milgram's, and we have to use Scout when we evaluate a theory. So I'm going to pause for 5 seconds if you'd like to pause the video to think of how you can evaluate this theory before I go through the 3 main evaluation paragraphs you should use. Okay, so the first evaluation point is supporting research from Hoffling. So you can see the outline of Hoffling's study in more detail in the right hand corner of the screen if you wish to use it and go into more detail. However, for your paragraph, all you need to know is that in Hoffling's study, 21 out of 22 nurses administered a dangerous amount of a drug because the doctor, an authority figure, told them to. This is a strength of agency theory because it shows the nurses entering the agentic state and doing as they were told because they wouldn't feel responsible because a doctor who has more power and more superiority over them has told them to. Other evaluations for agency theory is that actually it gives people an excuse for their behaviour. For example, if we link it to Nazi Germany, it ignores the racism and prejudice that was underpinned by Nazis. And so the problem with agency theory is that it allows people an excuse. They would just say, well, I was just following orders, rather than taking accountability for their behaviour and actually the fact that it was because they agreed maybe with those racist views. However, saying that, you can also talk about how useful this theory is to help us understand why things like the Holocaust happen. So it does have real life application because it explains lots of things in society, for example, the Holocaust, helping us to understand why soldiers are able to follow orders and kill innocent people even today, even in the 21st century, not just from the Holocaust. And lastly, this evaluation point would only be necessary if you know about Milgram's study. And in Milgram's study, the electric shock experiment that I spoke briefly about at the start, 35% of participants didn't continue following orders. So social factors can't fully explain obedience because it doesn't explain why some people refuse to carry out the order, why not 100% of people would obey. It can't explain that. Something that might explain this slightly better are the dispositional factors. So Adorno, like Milgram, wanted to find out why people obey authority figures. However, he said it's something within the person, it's a psychological disorder. And he said it was due to something known as the authoritarian personality. This personality is made up of lots of different characteristics which we'll look at. But mainly it's because people have an exaggerated respect for authority. They really look up to those of high status and therefore are more likely to obey those orders because they desire those people at the top of the hierarchy. And therefore they look down on people that are less than them. So people they may see as less than them are women, homosexuals, people from minority ethnic groups. So the characteristics of an authoritarian personality, as we've said, they have a huge respect for authority, therefore are more likely to obey authority figures. They look down on those below them. Okay, that would be enough for you to learn. But if you want to know more, then you can talk about how they held stereotypical views. So women are emotional and weak, and they believe that society can be divided into the strong and the weak. And they might also be aggressive towards minority groups, so different ethnicities other than white. The causes of an authoritarian personality, again, you might want to learn 1 or 2 of these, but generally the best point to learn is as it develops as a child. So they get very strong discipline from their parents. Their parents often criticise them and have high standards that the child struggles to achieve, which means they grow up only getting affection when they behave correctly, which is for them very difficult to achieve. As we've said, the parents have high standards. So therefore, as they get older, they start to feel angry and hostile about their parents. And so they take this out on people below them. And also they try to flatter people above them because they could never flatter their parents. So this could link to a very good key term here called scapegoating, which is when your feelings of hostility and anger get placed onto someone that is less than you, socially inferior. So in the case of authoritarian personality, women might be the inferior to a male and they may scapegoat a female. Or you might have a bad day at school, you might get home and take it out on a younger sibling or someone younger than you because you can't do it to the authority figure, parents or carers. When evaluating obedience and the dispositional explanation, the easiest thing to do is to contrast it with the social explanation, agency theory, and the same can be said for when you're evaluating agency theory. You can contrast it with this theory because they are opposites. But again, the dispositional explanation doesn't explain all cases of obedience. The authoritarian personality cannot explain the millions of people in Germany who were very disobedient. Not all Germans have an authoritarian personality, so it's not a good enough explanation on its own. And as I say, you can use your knowledge of social factors to further that point. Some more evaluation points for you to learn are on the screen about authoritarian personality and the dispositional explanation of obedience. I'm going to go through the answers in 5 seconds, so if you want to pause the video and have a go. Okay, so a weakness of the theory is that it can provide an excuse, again, for people following dangerous or destructive orders. They can excuse it and say, well, it's because I have this personality type. It's because I was raised this way as a child. A strength, however, is that Milgram conducted interviews with people from his study, the people that were willing to electrocute someone and potentially kill them. And what he found was a correlation. He found that they scored highly on the questionnaire that measured whether they were authoritarian personality or not. So there was a positive correlation. The more obedient a participant was, the more likely they were to be an authoritarian personality. So that's a strength. However, the questionnaire itself is a weakness. It's based on the questionnaire, which is called an F scale, and participants might have lied or not understood the questions. And also because it's correlational, there's no cause and effect. It could just be a coincidence that these people that did follow the orders had an authoritarian personality. That could be a coincidence and not the cause. Another weakness is one we have already looked at on the previous slide, that it doesn't explain the highly obedient or disobedient Germans. It doesn't explain everyone, basically. And then lastly, Adorno believed the authoritarian personality is caused by strict parents, but others believe it's due to a lack of education. So that's definitely a weakness. Now, remember, you only need 3 strong evaluation paragraphs for a maximum 9-mark question. So choose 3 from the screen that you feel confident in and maybe 1 as a backup. But that concludes this video. Thank you for watching. I hope you found it useful.